And that was the closing bell on Wall Street on day 10 of the U.S. war with Iran, as the president makes new comments suggesting the war with Iran is nearly over, even as Iran names a new hardline leader he deemed unacceptable. Stocks made a late-day surge following the president's comments in an interview with CBS, where he said, quote, "I think the war is very complete, pretty much." The Dow finishing higher after initially trading lower on concerns about the economic toll of war. The price of oil also making a dramatic shift. It had spiked to nearly $120 a barrel over the weekend in response to growing panic about supply disruptions. But after the president's comments, the price is now down to roughly $85 a barrel. It comes as, for everyday Americans, the price at the pump has been soaring, with the average price per gallon up nearly 50 cents since just last week. That after these stunning images over the weekend of a massive explosion and an eruption of flames after Israel's military hit an oil depot in Tehran. After oil producers in the Mideast announced they were reducing production because of the conflict. Amid the upheaval, the Trump administration is trying to ease concerns about rising gas prices, which could become a liability for the president and his party in the upcoming midterms.
Are you worried about gas prices right now?
No, this is a short excursion into something that should have been done for 47 years.
This is a short-term disruption. We're seeing a slight increase in oil and gas prices, but ultimately taking out the rogue Iranian regime is going to be a good thing for the oil industry, and those prices are going to come back down.
The president's going to continue to stay focused on ending a 47-year conflict, stay focused on growing the global energy supply. This is actually part of that effort. It does involve a temporary impediment to energy production, but on the other side, it'll allow much more energy production and much lower energy prices.
In a major development over the weekend, Iran named their new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the former supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. It's a decision that could prolong the war as Israel's military vows to go after every successor appointed by Iran. And as President Trump told NBC News, "I think they made a big mistake. I don't know if it's going to last. I think they made a mistake." Meanwhile, the fighting in the region continues to escalate. Yesterday, Meet the Press moderator Kristen Welker asking Iran's foreign minister under what conditions Iran would agree to end the war.
You know, everywhere, people have been killed, places have been destroyed, and now they want to ask for a ceasefire again? Well, this doesn't work like this. So there should be a permanent end of the war. And unless we get to that, I think we need to, continue fighting for the sake of our people and our security.
And the question remains whether the U.S. will deploy U.S. troops into Iran. Sources tell NBC News that the president has privately expressed serious interest in such a deployment. Here's what he and his defense secretary said over the weekend about the possibility.
What are the circumstances where you send in ground troops? How are you thinking about that?
I don't even want to talk about it now. I don't think it's an appropriate question. You know, I'm not going to answer it. Could there be? Possibly, for very good reason. Have to be very good reason. And I would say if we ever did that, they would be so decimated that they wouldn't be able to fight at the ground level.
President Trump knows, I know, you don't tell the enemy, you don't tell the press, you don't tell anybody what your limits would be on an operation. We're willing to go as far as we need to in order to be successful.
Joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Monia Alba, NBC News business and economy reporter Allie Canal, and NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube. Monia, I do want to start with you because we just got this news in from the CBS interview. What is your take on the president's comment here about the war nearly being finished?
Well, look, Mel, I think we have really seen some mixed messaging just about the timeline question alone in the last 24 hours. It seems the indications were from the Department of Defense and others that in some ways the most intense attacks against Iran were just getting started or were still yet to come. So if the president is now indicating in that new phone interview that this may be winding down, that this may be close to completion, that is the first time that we are really hearing that. Now, is this perhaps the president making that assessment based off of some of these goals that he has set out initially in terms of annihilating the Iranian Navy or some of these other military-specific goals? Perhaps that is what that is. But the president initially was the one who also set out this timeline of 4 to 5 weeks. The White House just on Friday said it was looking more like 4 to 6 weeks. So at what point are we really within that range, or is the president trying to signal to nervous markets or to Americans that this is something that is slowly going to stop or begin to scale back and scale down? That is the main question, and one that I know plenty of reporters are going to have for the president when we do expect he takes questions a short time from now. Mel.
And just last week, the president was asked about what the worst case scenario in Iran would be. And what he said was if the next supreme leader is as bad as the previous person. So is that how the White House views the current situation in Iran with the appointment of yet another hardliner as the supreme leader?
Well, the president is saying that he's not very happy about that. Remember that in the last couple of days, he had indicated, even in interviews with our colleagues at NBC News, that he hoped to have a larger role in perhaps determining who the future leadership or what the future leadership of Iran could look like. The president has still sort of taken that stance. So when you're talking about the new Ayatollah, the son of the Ayatollah who died more than a week ago, the president has made his feelings about him known. But again, the mechanism through which that could change or what the U.S. role would be in that is still an open question. This is an administration that has argued this is not a regime change war, but they would like to see the regime change completely. Secretary Hegseth, when he was pressed on that in recent interviews, said that that is still what they would like to see happen and that they believe through their objectives, ultimately, that is something that can be accomplished. But the president has tried to reduce this, Mel, to what he did in Venezuela with the capture of Nicolas Maduro and then Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president, taking over there. This is clearly not the same, not as simple, not as clear cut, even though the president has been trying to make some of those comparisons.
Well, and these rising prices also come as our NBC News poll shows that voters feel that the president's policies are actually hurting their economic conditions. So what are you hearing from White House officials about how they plan to tackle these rising gas prices, and how much of a priority is it really for the president?
Yeah, this has been a focus of a lot of high-level discussions in recent days. I'm told by a U.S. official familiar with the conversations that the president was also going to be briefed and presented with some potential additional options to mitigate some of these oil prices today. Unclear whether he is prepared to announce what some of those plans might be. But according to the White House in a statement on the record from a spokesperson here, they essentially say that there is no higher priority than this for the president in terms of what this might mean for Americans and what it might mean for the pain they are currently feeling at the pump, that he is continuing to review all, quote, credible options right now, and that there are plans they believe they can roll out, even though for now they say that they have a strong game plan in place, according to that statement, to keep the energy markets stable well before. They claim that that was in the works even before this military war and conflict started. And they're going to continue to see if there's anything else that can help. But as you saw in what you played in the intro, they're arguing that there will be short-term pain that eventually will be eased. The question is how long that takes and how much do the American people really feel that? Mel.
Something definitely to look out for. Monica, thank you so much. Allie, I want to turn to you because the president's comments suggesting that the war is nearly complete appear to be moving energy markets. So what more can you tell us here?
Yeah, significant shift here in the price of crude oil. Remember when markets reopened Sunday evening, crude oil traded as high as $115 a barrel. We are now closer to just around $85 a barrel. That's a more than 30% swing here. Now, gas prices, they tend to move pretty quickly when it comes to the price of oil. So there is a real possibility that we could see gas prices maybe come down a little bit. You're seeing the national average we have at around $3.48 a gallon. You compare that to last month when we were at $2.90 a gallon. Of course, this is a very volatile story. A lot of this has to do with disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, that very critical energy choke point, along with any other countries announcing cuts to their oil production. We've already heard that from Kuwait and the UAE. That impacts supply as well and therefore drives those prices higher.
Right. You mentioned gas prices. I mean, gas is almost up 50 cents nationwide compared to a week ago. So is it possible that we might still see some price increases on the way? And is it possible that we could end up paying as much as $4 a gallon?
Yeah, $4 a gallon, that's a very psychological level for consumers, right? They hear $4 and they start to pull back on other things. There are some states that are already seeing this. In California, for example, the national average is above $5 a gallon. Some stations in that state are actually charging as much as $8 a gallon. So this is being felt across the nation in different ways. Now, analysts have said if we stay around that $90 a barrel range in crude, we could see gas prices hover closer to that $3.50 to $3.65 range, and then maybe come down a little bit depending on how this situation escalates. But again, very volatile story, and it all depends on the day to day. You saw the massive swings that we just got over the past 15 minutes. All have to do with President Trump's comments. Still a lot of question marks, though, and a lot that remains to be seen.
Yeah, no doubt. And when we hear about higher oil prices, we tend to think of higher gas prices. But the cost of other items are also tied to oil hikes. So what else can Americans expect to pay more for in the coming weeks?
Yeah, I mean, oil is really the lifeline when it comes to the overall U.S. economy, right? It flows through into food, manufacturing, shipping, jet fuel. Your airline ticket prices could be going up. And the Strait of Hormuz isn't just a critical energy choke point. It also is a critical area for other types of commodities like aluminum, sugar, fertilizer. So it really impacts the whole supply chain, the whole global supply chain. And we tend to see that show up in higher prices that ultimately the consumer has to bear.
Allie, thank you so much. Courtney, I want to turn to you now. You've been doing such incredible reporting with our colleagues, including on the question, this big question of whether there will be U.S. troops on the ground. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we know that the president has seriously discussed this option. And we're not talking about necessarily a huge ground invasion with 130,000 troops like we saw in Iraq in 2003, but instead a more tailored force. And these conversations have occurred when the president's talking more about a post-war Iran. And I don't mean decades down the road. I mean post-military objectives being complete. We've heard them over and over now. It's decimate the Navy, destroy the missile launchers, destroy the missile production facility, destroy their drone capabilities. But once that's complete, the president has talked about this using the U.S. military, again, in smaller numbers, to do things like to ensure that the uranium stockpile is either safe or destroyed or whatever it is. But as part of the nuclear program, there could be other alternatives that the president could use, things like ensuring some sort of a post-war or post-conflict agreement between the U.S. and Iran for oil, similar to what we've seen in Venezuela. So, again, it's a more tailored force, but I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's still boots on the ground.
Right. Soldiers are soldiers. We heard Secretary Hegseth say that the Pentagon is willing to go as far as necessary to be successful. But how clear is it what successful is in the eyes of the Pentagon?
They have been very they've laid out these immediate or more near-term military objectives of going after the Iranian military. But the reality is, Mel, this is not the entire effort here that the U.S. is looking towards. No one is talking about the military being used directly for regime change, but the reality is they are moving everything in that direction. So I suspect once we get through these near-term objectives, again, of going after the missile program, their military, the nuclear program, and we hear about Iran cannot have the ability to have a nuclear weapon. The president has said that. Many of his officials have said that, but they haven't yet hit any of the nuclear programs. So is that part of the next level of objectives? It's not very clear, and officials who we ask about it, they say they don't want to get out ahead of what they're planning to do.
I know the other big story that we've been following is this 160 people that were killed at an elementary school in southern Iran from a strike. Here's what the president said about that over the weekend.
Mr. President, did the United States bomb a girls' elementary school in southern Iran on the first day of the war and kill 170?
No, in my opinion, based on what I've seen, that was done by Iran.
Is that true, Mr. Hegseth? It was Iran who did that?
We're certainly investigating.
Still investigating?
But the only side that targets civilians is Iran.
We think it was done by Iran. Because they're very inaccurate, as you know, with their munitions. They have no accuracy whatsoever. It was done by Iran.
Courtney, what are you hearing on this, and what's the latest on the Pentagon investigation?
Very important to point out the president said that was his opinion because it is still under investigation. Now, a couple of the facts that we know so far is the U.S. military was operating in and targeting that area where that school was located. The Israeli military was not. There have been videos now that appear to show a U.S. munition that landed in or near. So again, it's under investigation. You know, I'm hesitant to provide any kind of a conclusion, but the officials we're speaking to are saying, look, it's looking more and more likely that this was a U.S. munition that hit that school.
The other storyline I want to get to is that Trump said in that interview with CBS News that he's thinking about taking over the Strait of Hormuz. What would that look like, and is that even feasible?
Okay, so right now, no. For that to be feasible right now with a U.S. military would be an enormous undertaking. And it would also be very dangerous for two reasons. Number one, Iran still has drones. The biggest threat to shipping right now are drones. The second thing that Iran has are mines. And it's not even clear Iran has full control over their mining capability in the Strait of Hormuz. So it would take a huge number of U.S. ships and aircraft, and it would most likely have to be some sort of a consortium, not just U.S., to be able to do that. That would take the military assets away from the ongoing fight, which they are very much engaged in. So right now, until the threat from Iran is mitigated significantly, it's a very dangerous undertaking. It would take a huge amount of personnel and ships and aircraft. I don't see them doing that anytime soon until they're able to do more against the drone program.
Really important insight. Courtney, Kube, thank you so much. Joining me now is Jonathan Panikoff. He is a former senior intelligence officer and now a director of Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. I want to start with this question of what do you know about Iran's supreme leader, and how do you expect he will rule over Iran?
Thanks for having me. Look, I think what's clear is that he is the most hardline of any of the possible candidates that were likely to succeed former Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The reality is that he's the closest to the guards of any of the possible candidates. His positions are quite hardline, as I mentioned. And I think really what you're going to be looking for more than anything is consistency. This was an act of resistance by Iran following the president's comments. He's probably not the person who would have been chosen had his father died by, say, natural causes. But here we are.
Do you think that he will still have the same iron grip over Iran that his father did?
I think it's unlikely that he'll be able to have the same level of influence. The reality is the guards have consolidated more and more power, in part because the previous supreme leader relied on them more and more. The guards are in every part of not just obviously Iran's military, but its economy, from construction to the oil networks. And so I think, yes, he will probably work well with them initially, but it's unlikely that he's going to have the same level of control that his father did.
Jonathan, based on what you're seeing, is this war with Iran about regime change? Is it about oil? Is it about Iran's nuclear and ballistic program? Or is it just not clear to you what the end goal really is here?
I think there's a split, right? I think for the Israelis, the actual end goal is quite clear. They've been clear that it's really about regime change and that they think that they need to fundamentally shake the regime so hard that it largely breaks and there's an opportunity for the opposition. We've heard some of that from the U.S., from President Trump, but we've heard a variety of goals, frankly, throughout the last 9 days, from President Trump, from Secretary Hegseth, from Secretary Rubio. I think they're quite happy, obviously, to achieve a military objective of diminishing Iran's nuclear capabilities, diminishing its ballistic missile capabilities, diminishing its navy. But at the end of the day, we'd be very, very far from regime change. And if that's the goal, it's not clear to me what the strategy is to get there.
We were also just discussing with Courtney that the president has not ruled out U.S. boots on the ground. What would the goal of a U.S. military presence in Iran be?
I think it would look very different than, say, what a lot of Americans are used to in terms of Iraq or Afghanistan, the wars we've been through the last number of decades. It probably would be limited in scope, but that doesn't mean that it's easy. The complications of inserting a force to deal with the highly enriched uranium that's still in Iran, or even to take over, say, Karg Island, which is a critical transport point for Iranian oil, where about over 90% of its oil exports usually go through. I think it would be incredibly difficult, but I do think it would be much more limited than, say, a full-scale invasion for regime change a la Iraq in 2003.
And Jonathan, we've also learned that Russia is providing Iran with intelligence on the location of U.S. forces in the region. But could you see a scenario where Russia provides even more assistance to Iran, such as providing weapons, even as they're in the midst of their own war with Ukraine?
Yeah, I think you hit it right there at the end is the key point. The problem is I don't think the Russians have right now extra troops, extra munitions to frankly spear to help the Iranian regime. I think they will try to continue to provide diplomatic cover. If they can provide intelligence, they certainly will. But I haven't seen any indications to say that they're going to provide new air defense systems, for example, to replace those that Israel blew up many, many months ago.
Really important points. Jonathan Panikoff, thank you so much.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.